Uh, Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the this new version of Dialogues. And thank you, Madhumita, for this opportunity to host this very interesting session today with Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya. Keeping in mind that today we have the interesting events going on in our neighboring country of Afghanistan, today's talk, I think, is going to be very, very interesting. Ambassador Mukhopadhyay has masters in sociology from Delhi School of Economics, and then he joined Indian Forest Service in 1980. He served in the Ministries of External Affairs and Defense of India as a consultant and as a consultant on deputation to the UN in New York on social development. And eventually, he became India's ambassador to Syria in 2005 to 2008, and then Afghanistan from 2010 to 2013 as ambassador. And then before that, he had reopened the Indian embassy in Kabul in November 2001. And then he also was ambassador to Myanmar from 2013 to 2016. He has also graduated from National Defense College of India and has worked on Afghanistan as a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is at Washington D.C. And then he's currently a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, which works on the policy research for the Indian institutions. We are very fortunate to have him with us today to talk to us about the current situations in Afghanistan and its impact on the Indian subcontinent. So I welcome Ambassador Mukhopadhyay today among us. And
Thank you.
sir, please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Arora, and especially Professor Madhumita Sengupta for organizing this event. It's always a pleasure to speak to the academic community, particularly students. And students from a kind of IIT background, of course, is a special privilege. Let me, just mention that uh, a little bit about the Center for Policy Research, where I'm currently associated, because I think it's a very interesting think tank. It's one of India's leading established independent think tanks. And unlike many other think tanks, which tend to have a focus on one aspect, maybe economy, energy, or security, or foreign relations, this is a very multidisciplinary think tank. And in many, in times past, it has made very notable contributions both to kind of economic policy. It's a very much a policy advocacy think tank. It's made sort of great contributions to economic policy. It's made also great contributions to water issues, energy issues. Today, for example, it's also very well known for taking on issues like climate change. And then, of course, virtually everything from rights issues, urbanization, almost you name it, forests, environment, climate change, everything is more or less covered by the CPR. So it also makes working there interesting because you're actually addressing at the same time very different kind of specializations. So that's a little bit about the CPR. So let me just get down to the subject. I think obviously Afghanistan is a matter of great topical interest currently, and I think it's likely to remain so for quite some time. I will try and touch on as much of what is current and what is worth knowing about Afghanistan in the short period that I have. So, and of course, I'll be very open to questions and answers. So let me start off with who are the Taliban. I will assume that, of course, many of you know quite a lot about Afghanistan and the Taliban and the rest of it. But essentially, the Taliban uh, were were reared in the 1990s in the madrasas of and the refugee camps of Afghan refugees on the Pakistani side of the Durand Line, which actually unofficially operates as a kind of border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. I say unofficially because Afghanistan has formally never exactly recognized it. So this is one point. And essentially, they were reared originally from orphans, left over by the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. So primarily, this is their origin. They were actually raised by the then Home Minister of Pakistan during Benazir Bhutto's time in government. And essentially, they were conceived of and they were formed as a kind of religious militia uh, under them. And Pakistan's sort of original plan was to sort of use them as a kind of caravan to open routes for Pakistan through to Central Asia. But I think one of the key sort of points of agenda about the Taliban was that Pakistan has always had this Pashtun problem with involving the Durand Line and also involving Afghanistan. On the Afghanistan side, for some time there has been a kind of demand, mostly starting with Pakistan's independence in 1947, a demand for Pashtunistan, particularly among the Pashtuns of Afghanistan. As you know, the Pashtuns are divided with a small component, with a smaller component in Afghanistan and actually a larger component in the border areas of Pakistan. And so there has been this sense amongst the Pashtuns that they have been divided by the British via the Durand Line, which was originally conceived of as a kind of, arrangement between the British and the Afghan king of that time, which was Shah Shuja. Oh no, it was later than Shah Shuja, as a kind of buffer zone, basically to keep the Russians away. So they drew the border line with Tsarist Russia at the Amu Darya in the north, and on this side with the Durand Line with India. So there has been this feeling that the Pashtuns want to reunite, particularly from the Afghan side, and from time to time the demand from Pashtunistan would go up and down. Pakistan has been trying to more or less formalize this border for quite a long time, and this was in a way an effort by Pakistan to raise this group, partly utilizing their Pashtun identity, but actually, in many ways trying to submerge their larger Pashtun and even their Afghan identity within a larger kind of identity of Islam within Muslims. So, in a way, to try and blur and try and dilute the demand for Pashtunistan, I think that was one of the ideas behind that. So Taliban 1.0, as people now call it, which was the period that they managed to dominate in 1996 to 2001, was a period, what actually happened before that was that the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan in 1979. And as you know, there was a very strong resistance. Much of that resistance was grouped together in Pakistan. They were known as the Mujahideen. They were grouped together in an alliance called the Seven-Party Alliance. And they were funded covertly by the United States as well as other Islamic countries, as in order to create a kind of religious war against the Soviets at that time. So that's why it was called a jihad, and the leaders that came out of it were also called jihadi leaders. After the Soviets withdrew in 1989, then you had a period when President Najibullah, who was then the president of Afghanistan under the regime of that time that was called the PDPA, he continued for about 3 years, so until about 1992. Between 92 and 96, in fact, it was the Mujahideen who came back to Kabul. But this was a very unstable period in which the Mujahideen fought amongst each other. There were very sharp conflicts involving various leaders, but amongst them there used to be a Hazara leader called Mazari. But the principal fighting, which led to a lot of destruction, particularly in Kabul and around, was between Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was a leader of the Tajiks, and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was very much a Pashtun leader, very much backed by Pakistan. And the destruction that they inflicted on Afghanistan at that time was such. I perhaps it was not mentioned. I didn't mention it also. Yeah, we mentioned it that I reopened the embassy in 2001. So Kabul, most of New Kabul in particular, was completely shattered. Pockmarked with bullets and rockets and things like that. So. So when the Taliban first came, they were actually sort of perceived as pious religious students who grew up in these refugee camps, studied in these madrasas, and they appointed a kind of a respected religious cleric by the name of Mullah Umar as their kind of leader. When I say they appointed, it's not very clear who appointed, but I suspect that Pakistani intelligence may have had a hand in doing that. But once he was appointed, even the Al Qaeda leaders at that time, swore their loyalty to what was then named the Amir ul Momineen. And there is a cloak that is, according to legend, was worn by the Prophet, peace be upon him, at that, in his time, that he wore, and the mantle of the Amirul Momineen, that means the leader of the faithful, was bestowed on him. So initially, the Taliban was seen as a kind of stabilizing force. They brought stability at a time when the intra-Mujahideen fighting was taking place. And essentially, they were a very ultra-conservative force who had really no interest other than trying to impose their version of Islam, which they had learned from the very conservative madrasas on the Pakistani side of the Durand Line, which acts as their border, in madrasas such as the Haqqaniya network. And there was another person who called Samiul Haq, who was kind of regarded as the father of the Taliban. And essentially, they were taught a rather distorted and backward form of what they called Deobandi Islam. The school of Deoband, which actually is in India, goes back many, many years to the early years of our independence movement. And in many ways, it was not just the Deobandi influence, because they also brought in, via the Saudis, via the Gulf charities that were quite active in these areas through all those years, including the Taliban years. Wahhabi doctrine came from Saudi Arabia. Later on, there were elements of Salafi kind of philosophy and all that as well. So essentially, Taliban 1.0, they weren't yet a terrorist force. They were an ultra-conservative religious militia who imposed their rule by force, no doubt. Imposed very backward interpretation of the Shariat, which included things like amputation of hands for thieves, no place at all in society for women. Education was affected. Women were kept in parda. They couldn't step out without a full burqa, or be accompanied by their relatives. And they used to resort to punishments like flogging, public flogging, and in many cases there were also executions. And very often these were, almost in stadia, in a kind of exhibition of state violence. But Taliban 2.0, so this is when, as you know, after 9/11, the US intervened in Afghanistan. The primary reason why they intervened was that the Taliban had been giving shelter to Osama bin Laden. By this time, Osama bin Laden had become quite notorious. Again, many of you may know that the Al Qaeda emerged in the it was in the 90s really. The sort of first big attacks were in two US embassies in East Africa, in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And the United States actually launched cruise missile attacks in Afghanistan at that time. Actually, some of the camps that were affected were really Lashkar-e-Taiba camps that were also being established under Taliban rule in Afghanistan at that time. So you had, and for some time there were some negotiations actually between the US and the Taliban. The Taliban and the US had been negotiating over things like a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan, and even the United States was trying to understand this phenomenon. Remember, at that time the United States thought of these religious fight these mujahideen as religious fighters against the Soviet Union. So they didn't really have such a bad opinion of them at that time. And so they negotiated with the Taliban to try and see if they would hand over Osama bin Laden. But, in a kind of very tribal, very Pashtun, very Afghan, also very Muslim sense of hospitality, they absolutely refused to part with, a leader who they considered to be their guest. As a result of which, after 9/11, the United States intervened and decided to take out essentially Al Qaeda and bin Laden. But before that, there was one other significant development. 2 days before 9/11, the Al-Qaeda, apparently with the help of Pakistani intelligence, actually organized a press, a television interview with Ahmad Shah Massoud, who at that time was ensconced in northern Afghanistan, in his home province of Panjshir, but also in Badakhshan, going up towards Tajikistan. And in the pretext of an interview, they actually sent a suicide squad and they detonated their explosives in Ahmad Shah Massoud's presence. And of course, Ahmad Shah Massoud died. He was martyred to the cause. And in many ways, by eliminating that, they eliminated, the Al Qaeda thought that they had eliminated the last resistance to extremism, to fundamentalism, to this kind of Al Qaeda terrorism and Taliban rule in Afghanistan, so that they would have had a free hand to conduct more terrorist exercises. 2 days after that took place 9/11. You all know what happened then. And then the US intervened. Initially, they intervened very lightly. They intervened through CIA operatives who backed the Northern Alliance, which consisted of many leaders from the ethnic communities in the north. They also actually included some Pashtun leaders who disagreed and who differed from the Taliban. And over a period of October and November, they were able to oust the Taliban from initially also from Kabul and eventually from Afghanistan entirely. They chased bin Laden. He was thought to be in the hills between Kabul and the Pakistani border at a place called Tora Bora, but it appears that Osama bin Laden got away, and eventually he was eliminated only in 2011, 10 years later, in in a cantonment town in Pakistan, virtually under the nose and eyes of the Pakistani army. So that's as far. So it was in this period of its ouster from Afghanistan that the Taliban really became a terrorist outfit. Not immediately. It's possible that there may not have been a grand design behind this, but initially they took shelter there. And then, as the United States made various kinds of mistakes, and also the Afghan government made various kinds of mistakes, they not only regrouped themselves but also radicalized themselves, adopted more and more terrorist means in order to be able to, regain control of Afghanistan. And amongst those means were, of course, religious indoctrination continued. They started being trained in using, IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Gradually, in fact, they started being recruited for suicide missions, suicide squads. And they also started indoctrinating more and more mullahs, Maulvis, who were religious teachers. Many of them were recruited from provinces in Afghanistan and sent back to spread their radicalization. And as their training advanced, they got trained in more advanced weaponry, mostly light weaponry, but also in due course things like night visions, more sophisticated equipment. They started undertaking commando attacks, complex attacks using not just human suicide bombs, but vehicle-borne suicide attacks, complex attacks that included commando and vehicle-borne suicide attacks. And in fact, 3 of those attacks were targeted at the Indian embassy in Kabul in 2008, 2009, and 2010. And this was just a little before the period that I returned there as ambassador. Initially, I was there just for a period of about 3 to 4 months, from November 2001 to about March 2002. This also happened to be the period of, the attack against our parliament. There was nearly a state of war between India and Pakistan at that stage. Flights were discontinued. So there was a lot that was happening in the India-Pakistan space as well at that time. So this was the period that they were radicalized. Today, very often people talk about the Taliban returning to power as Taliban 2.0. But in many ways, I see Taliban 2.0 as this period of radicalization in Pakistan. And not just by radicalization, I actually mean as a kind of suicide force. And then in the next 20 years, taking advantage of various mistakes that the United States and others made. For example, by 2003-4, the US thought that it had more or less completed its mission of eliminating Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, even though Osama bin Laden was still absconding. And at that point, what were then called the neocons in the United States were talking about remaking the Middle East, basically eliminating all the possible threats to Israel at that time. And one of their targets was Saddam Hussein, which is when that they trained their attention to Iraq, eliminated Saddam Hussein, and this period, when the US took its eye off the ball in Afghanistan and moved its attention to Iraq, which then occupied it for a very long time, became a very good period for the Taliban to regroup. So by the time the United States came back to Afghanistan once again in sizable force, this was after they had intervened in Iraq. Then in Iraq they had to deal with a very messy counterinsurgency for a long time. So learning the lessons from that counterinsurgency, the United States came back, or rather strengthened itself in Afghanistan once again with the counterinsurgency phase of their intervention there. So they started off with what was called counterterrorism, again, very limited to the Al Qaeda. They never actually declared their war on the Taliban, even though they took many Taliban prisoners to Guantanamo. This was a period when the U.S. Army also, did a lot of excesses, particularly in Iraq. There were what were called renditions, where so-called designated terrorists or alleged terrorists were taken away and eventually taken away to Guantanamo for interrogation. And a lot of that also happened from Afghanistan. This was also a period when U.S. Army indulged in quite a few excesses in Afghanistan. Basically, Afghans are very conservative people. They're very protective towards their women. But the Americans, perhaps, out of ignorance, they would very often barge into homes, and the Pashtuns would feel very dishonored because their women would be exposed and so on. So, these were some of the things that contributed to the radicalization also within Afghanistan. So, though the Taliban were very much a kind of Afghan militia raised in Pakistan, in many ways indoctrinated and brainwashed in those madrasas in Pakistan, there were also grievances that started growing within Afghanistan that got them support. And so this whole notion of foreign occupation, a whole narrative of foreign occupation, of the US troops being occupation troops, started coming in. Remember, they were not originally an occupation army. In fact, they were welcome. They had the sanction of the United Nations. Even countries that was their strategic rivals, that like China and Russia and even Iran, actually sympathized with the terrorist attacks against the United States, and actually assisted through through air bases, through transit arrangements, through Central Asia, the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. But of course, the biggest dependence that the U.S. had was on Pakistan, because Pakistan became the most convenient ground line of communications. So all their equipment, all their logistics, all their facilities were being, by and large, being taken through Pakistan. And there's a story there also. In 2001, when this happened and the US decided to intervene in Afghanistan, they sent their, then I think it was Assistant Secretary of State, if I'm not wrong, Richard Armitage, with a message, clear message to President Musharraf that, either you support us on the war on terror or we bomb you back to the Stone Age. So Musharraf had no choice but to support the war on terror. And of course, they also compensated them with coalition funds for all the usage of their territory and their services and so on. But even while they did that, as the chinks in the armor started exposing, as they turned their attention to Iraq, as the Taliban, began to regroup in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, they started forming their shuras, that were essentially their councils. One was called the Quetta Shura, another was called the Peshawar Shura. Later on, they also came about a Miram Shah Shura. So around these shuras, which were all hosted in Pakistan, the Pakistanis simultaneously, were helping the Americans, but also helping the insurgency. By this time, it had become an insurgency, helping the Taliban. In fact, also conducting attacks against U.S. troops. In fact, by the end of it, the United States had lost about 2,400 troops in the 20-year campaign in Afghanistan. So this was the phase of their radicalization. And every time there were signals from the United States that they would be leaving. For example, by about 2009-10, they began to realize that, that this was getting too prolonged, that there was never going to be a military solution. And together with the British, they started what were called peace and reconciliation talks. Starting with the London Conference, it was inscribed as an objective that we don't have a war with the Taliban, and that the Afghan government needs to reconcile with the Taliban and bring them back to Afghanistan. And um, in fact, so this kind of peace and reconciliation trend started. The Taliban got the message. They realized that the Americans are tired, that they would leave. Pakistanis got the message, and basically they decided to wait out the Americans, and in fact, continue to harass them so that they would eventually leave. So, starting from about 2008, I know there's an interesting phase here also when President Obama was uh, on the campaign trail. He talked of the uh, war in Iraq as a war of choice and the war in Afghanistan as a war of necessity. He said that in Afghanistan, the theater of the war was in Afghanistan, but the locus of the war was really in Pakistan. And that's why he created the mandate of a very distinguished American diplomat, Richard Holbrooke. He called that mandate the AFPAC mandate. In other words, it was not only about Afghanistan, it was about Afghanistan, Pakistan. So periodically, this was one sort of epiphany that the Americans kept having. Just as President Bush recognized that Pakistan was the problem when he sent Richard Armitage, uh, Obama realized that Pakistan was the problem. Later on in 2017, Trump came out with his South Asia strategy, August 2017. That also clearly nailed Pakistan as the principal problem. But each time the Americans would come to such a kind of such a conclusion, they were never able to follow it up with a kind of carrot and stick or the stick policy on Pakistan. In fact, the American attitude towards Pakistan can be characterized as more and more carrots, even as they harass them more and more. Their senior admirals, the Joint Chief of Staff, once described the Haqqani network as a veritable extension of the ISI in Afghanistan. So so there was this kind of knowledge that Pakistan was up to mischief in Afghanistan, but somehow there was never the will or never the clarity in the establishment, or even when there was a clarity, they were muddled into confusion. They were never able to follow up the problem that Pakistan was behind the Taliban, and in many ways, Pakistan created the Taliban as a kind of Afghan face, but pursuing a Pakistani agenda, both indoctrinated by them and a Pakistani hand behind them. That doesn't mean that the Afghans had absolutely no sense of nationalism, but as you know, when it finally came down to the crunch, they made deals with the United States, with Russia, with China, with Iran, just about every country in the world, but they never really indulged in or never really took part in good faith talks with other Afghans, which was the people who backed the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And in effect, between a choice between the emirate, which was their ideology that they wanted, the kind of state that they wanted, ruled by their interpretation of the Shariat, of religious law, and Afghanistan, they chose religion over the Afghan people. And in fact, through this entire period, um, I would say that Pakistan actually conducted, through the Taliban, a very sophisticated hybrid war in Pakistan over those 20 years, in which they used indoctrination, in which they used, radicalized mullahs to penetrate Afghanistan in different parts of Afghanistan. They used information warfare. They used information, the ICT, and they used narrative building in a very sophisticated way in order to project the war as a kind of holy war. They capitalized on all the mistakes that the United States made, as well as the Afghan government made. And the Afghan government too made lots of mistakes because although they were an Islamic republic and a democracy, there was a lot of corruption. The Americans say they invested 1 to 3 trillion in Afghanistan, but mostly they were spent, in a kind of gravy train, contracts that went to either foreign contractors or to local warlords and local contractors. So it basically created a very corrupt system and also created a predatory system. There were many military commanders who were really not ruling by principles of justice, but just predatory kind of governance. So in many areas, combined with attacks often by the US, later on by the ANDSF, grievances were also building up, which they capitalized on, and they used as their information warfare. They used psychological warfare on a massive scale because, for 12 to 14 years, there was almost daily acts of terrorism. And the whole idea behind that was a kind of war of attrition against the will of the Afghan people to, 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 to finish any kind of resistance. In the south, in Helmand, at one stage, there was a kind of Helmand peace initiative where people took out foot marches all the way to Kabul in order to oppose this kind of radicalism and violence. But that too never got anywhere. And then they use political deception in many ways. They use political deception in their negotiations with the United States, what came to be finally as the Doha deal of February 2020. They use political deception vis-a-vis the Afghan government in negotiations. Incidentally, the Afghan government from time of Karzai used to want to negotiate with the Taliban, and they opened all kinds of channels, channels through the tribal channels, intelligence channels with the Taliban. They actually got across to Mullah Baradar. When the Pakistanis discovered that Mullah Baradar was secretly talking to the Afghan government through their own agencies, they conducted a sting operation and got Baradar locked up for 8 years, during which he was apparently both psychologically and physically, practically broken down. He was rehabilitated only when the United States wanted to reopen talks with the Taliban, and he was the senior most Taliban leader available from Mullah Umar's time, and had a certain respectability about him. Um, so, you know, eh, so they use political deception in a very big way, and they also use political deception in the last stages of the military takeover of the Taliban, of Afghanistan. When, for example, they appeared to talk about coming to some kind of deal on a transitional government, but eventually nothing like that happened. They gave the Americans to believe that they would not take over the whole country, including Kabul, before August 31st, which was the officially stated date of departure of the United States. In fact, the United States had already withdrawn most of its troops. It had cleared Bagram Air Base. So despite all this, they used political deception in a very big way. And then, of course, the final military strategy of the takeover was a very sophisticated strategy. And in my view, could not have been just executed by, a ragtag bunch of insurgents, or even if they are not ragtag, let's say call it a disciplined group of Taliban insurgents led by essentially by religious leaders. They had to be, you know, masterminded in Pakistan by the GHQ, which is the general headquarters of the Pakistani army and the ISI. And in fact, their uh, involvement became very open in the last stages of the takeover of Afghanistan, when they tried to penetrate the Panjshir Valley. And, Pakistani regulars were involved, at least on the basis of reports coming out of the Pakistani press itself and the social media. But also, Pakistani drones, allegations of, other kinds of assistance from Pakistan, and the open presence of the ISI chief in Kabul in September 2021, uh, ostensibly to help in the formation of the cabinet of the government of the Taliban, but coincidentally also happened to be at the time that the Panjshir campaign was at its highest. And that was when they hopefully they attempted to eliminate the last bit of resistance, a resistance that remained in 1996 and to 2001, and which caused the return of the, which allowed for the return of, Ahmed Shah Massoud, I mean, the Northern Alliance to Kabul, and eventually the 20-year period that was the period of the Islamic Republic. So I think that is in terms of the Taliban. Very quickly, since I think I've spoken for about half an hour, I'll just take another 5-10 minutes. Why did the Afghan government collapse? So there are short-term reasons. I think many of them I've told you, the kind of psychological warfare that was conducted, the political deception that was conducted. But one very important fact was that the Americans, although they spent 20 years and they spent a lot of money, they never really invested in Afghanistan to help Afghanistan stand on its own feet. So they didn't really invest in democracy building. They played a lot of political, manipulation in deciding who the president would be, or in brokering compromises from time to time. But they didn't develop any grassroots institutions. They designed or helped design a very centralized constitution, a very centralized system of power, structure of power, with all power concentrated in the office of the president, in a country which was basically historically always quite dispersed and decentralized. They didn't really invest in the Afghan national army as a national army capable of defending its borders, defending itself and territory. In fact, just as they defined their own intervention in terms of counterterrorism, it's like expanded to counterinsurgency, and later on converted to a kind of training and equipping mission. They really developed counter-terrorist capabilities of the Afghan National Army. So they have first-class counter-terrorist special force units, but they were very stretched. They were not actually capable of territorial defense. And numbers of those units were not very much more or less than the Taliban. Perhaps they may even have been less. So they were excellent at being able to retake terrorist targets. And from time to time, when the Taliban would capture an entire town, let's say Kunduz or Ghazni, they were able to, with the help of US air support, even be able to recover those. But they were not really capable of spreading themselves outside the country and deal with borders, with insurgency all over the country. They were just simply not equipped to do that. The Americans didn't invest in the economy. Everybody knew Afghanistan stood on virtually 3 trillion worth of mineral reserves, but no effort was made to exploit that, which would have got Afghanistan revenues to be able to fund their own government. They didn't invest in trade capacity. Afghanistan's fruits and vegetables are, of course, very well known, dry fruits in particular. India was their biggest market. They could have tried to develop their trade capacity, from which, in the livelihood sector, which is where people gain their livelihoods, which would have brought some prosperity to the villages, which were basically just being securitized all the time, or treated as a security problem. India was their largest market. They had a transit trade agreement, Afghanistan-Pakistan transit trade agreement with Pakistan. But in that transit trade agreement, the Afghans were not allowed to import goods through the surface route from India. So they could export goods through Wagah, but they could not actually import anything, which made trade imbalanced and also unattractive, because effectively one-way, trucks and were going empty, so freight costs were also higher. So the Americans could have done a lot. They did something in civil society. They invested in education. They invested in, some amount of NGOs. The idea of individual rights, human rights, women rights. These are things that did catch up. They created an American University of Afghanistan, which was a very good center for scholarship for Afghans and so on. But they came in with a very limited, selfish vision. And I think the primary reason why they collapsed was a complete and total dependence. Created a kind of NATO standard army for which the Afghans were not equipped. They did not have the technical capacity to support it. As I said, they didn't even develop the normal engineering, logistics, and other sort of capacities of a regular army. And the total psychological dependence that they had on them. So the moment they withdrew, and they withdrew their air support, and they withdrew their contractors who provided the technical maintenance and repairs and the technical support, even sort of managing the software and things like that, they were in a psychological state of shock that I can only compare similar to India. When we lost the umbrella of the Soviet Union with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in many ways, we were also in a state of shock at that time. So just to round up, the effect of all this, the strategic fallout of all this is going to be very serious. For one, the United States withdrawing from virtually the weakest underbelly of China at a time that it has, projected China as its principal strategic rival in the world. In effect, it has ceded space to all its principal rivals globally and in the region: China, Russia, and Iran. And the collaterals are the Afghan people, the Afghan democracy, and you have seen how desperate people are to leave Afghanistan with the arrival of the Taliban. the Central Asian republics, and India. All those who supported a democratic regime were collateral damage. In effect, what the Americans did, and this may sound a little sharp, is that they not only they betrayed Afghan sovereignty for third country sponsored terrorism, they betrayed a moderate Islamic democratic government for an extremist theocratic government, and they betrayed the values of the Enlightenment, principally the values of freedom that you know from the Enlightenment through the French Revolution, through the American War of Independence, through world wars, and even the Indian struggle of independence. Because what, in effect, these Afghans who are desperate to leave Afghanistan now, they are fleeing extremism, they are fleeing they are fleeing Pakistani-sponsored tutelage and control over Afghanistan, and they are fleeing, fear and autocratic rule for the kind of rights that they had been more or less used to for the last 20 years. A second consequence is going to be a very rapid growth of terrorism, because not only have the Taliban come back, together with that they have emboldened Islamic radicals worldwide, region-wide, of course. And in the region, the Taliban have been fighting together in the trenches for the last 20 years or more, with a number of other radical movements in the region. In Kashmir, you know that we have a number of outfits that, based in Pakistan that are trying to, uh, you know, ostensibly fight for freedom, but also the version of freedom that they have adopted is, a kind of jihadi rule. Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Muhammad, Hizbul Mujahideen, um, and then you have sectarian outfits, anti-Shia outfits in Pakistan. You have movements like the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, something called the Jamaat Ansarullah in Tajikistan. You have the Dindullah, which is an extremist movement in the Sunni Baluch areas of Iran. You have, other outfits like the Sipahi, Sahiba, Lashkar-e then you have Al Qaeda, which continues to operate in Afghanistan. And then, in addition to that, you have the Islamic State, Khorasan, which is a kind of uh, branch of the Islamic State which grew up in Iraq and Syria. So you have a multiplicity of organizations that, for them, it's payback time. So long they have basically helped the Pakistanis and the Afghans to take over Afghanistan, but now they will see it as their opportunity to execute their jihad in the places of their choice. And that will be both the region, it will include India, and perhaps what you are seeing the beginnings of in Kashmir is a part of that. But they will also be operating globally. And sooner or later, the regional countries as well as the international community will face up to the fact that there is a kind of war. And the third thing that will happen is that it gives China a great space. Because if the US has vacated uh, the vacated the space in Afghanistan, it gives China an opportunity to build upon its BRI, to build upon its China-Pakistan economic corridor, and reach out over the Central Asian mountains towards Iran, with whom they have a 400 billion 25-year geo-economic deal with strategic overtones, and in fact become players in the Gulf and the Arab world. And it also provides China an opportunity to actually escape the kind of pressure that they are facing from the United States, from this new alliance called the AUKUS, and from the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. In other words, have an alternate route toward the energy sources of the Gulf through the Central Asian mountains. And of course, Pakistan and China would be riding piggyback on each other, because Pakistan's eventual aim is to sever all ties between Afghanistan and India, which have been historic and which have included trade, cultural exchange, religion, political campaigns, military campaigns, and everything. But essentially sever those connections and reorient it, pivot Afghanistan to be more a Central Asian country than its sort of bridge role between West Asia, Central Asia, and India, and make it completely independent and limit its South Asia kind of contacts to Pakistan. So all these things are happening. And finally, I would say that it also gives China an opportunity to talk about the superiority of its model. Whoever is in power anywhere will benefit from a kind of autocratic model that China has projected with its single party rule for the last 70 plus years. And in a way, whether it is whether it is a violent theocracy, or it is single-party rule, or it is military rule, or even sort of majoritarian democracies, as we see in various parts of the world, including South Asia, all of them would take comfort from the kind of autocratic model of China, which means to say that there are very few defenders for democracy and for freedom, um, which after all was what rescued the world from fascism during the Second World War and militarism in East Asia. So right now, both in terms of strategic kind of inroads, China has a net advantage. It doesn't mean that it will succeed, because China would also be entering a very unstable area where, as I said, there are many terrorist groups operating, and it will have to face that challenge on the one hand. On the other hand, there is also a kind of value issue involved in this. This is, I think, roughly what I would like to say about Afghanistan. I haven't really touched on India, but maybe I should take a break now, and then, since many of the questions I anticipate will also involve India, I will address them in the Q&A. Thank you.